Catholic social teaching has been quite clear that it holds the state to an obligation to provide care for the neighbor. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering where you think Luther directs us in that basic question.
Yeah, I think Luther definitely was the opinion that the community, which is the worldly community in his terms, which nowadays is something like the state. Mm-hmm. It is responsible, and the idea is that actually that the state are the human beings, basically, who form the community, and it's the form how they together can be responsible of all the individual members of the community. I think it was a very central idea for already in the Reformation time and in the social renewal, which also was part of Reformation, that they tried to form such kind of community where this idea is central. And there were also already at that time at least something that resembles very much of the modern idea of the so-called social rights, even though this concept wasn't not used or known at that time. But the idea that there is something that belongs to all the members, regardless of their social status or anything. They only are members, and for this reason, they have the right to have what they need for their decent living. And in the modern terms, this is the idea that society is responsible of this aspect. Thank you.
Any others? Theodor?
I have a question to Ron concerning your interpretation of the Heidelberg Disputation. It is interesting that Heidegger in the 1920s commented or dealt with the Heidelberg Disputation in a seminar, and he claimed that Luther was the first after Paul who understood Paul's remarks in 1 Corinthians about the stupidity of the cross. But the interesting thing is that he mainly used this as critical over against metaphysical claims. This is quite similar to what you did. But then he continued to say that he was not very satisfied and in agreement with Luther's further development, because Luther, to his disappointment, continued to develop a doctrine, to develop a theory with claims. And I think we have to evaluate this development after the Heidelberg Disputation. And I think this is a necessary development, and I would argue in favor of this development, but of course this would create difficulties for your approach. And, well, I would say according to my understanding of the Heidelberg Disputation, the main purpose of this disputation is precisely dealing with I said in my presentation about sin. Therefore, Luther doesn't talk so much about, as you said, about the theology of the cross or theology of glory, but about the person. And the person is the one who misuses even the best thing in a bad way. So it is dealing with a certain structure of striving and of desire. And I think this is, I would be hesitant to make too strong epistemological claims out of this, because this is a very precise situation. And the purpose of emphasizing suffering is precisely that the human being who wants the good and who is related to him or herself has to be frustrated by suffering. so that the desire of these people don't come to an end. And in accepting this frustration of one's original desire, this is the way where God is present. And therefore, he talks about the Theologia Crucis. But I would say the further process is that Luther talked, he did not use the phrase, but I think this is more precise then, that he talks about the theology of the crucified, Theologia Crucifixi. And that is, I think, Luther's point, that Christ did something for us which we do not have to do, and even not to suffer. But by our union with Christ, we participate in this. And I think this is a major progress, and this is related to the distinction between law and gospel in a way which is not, cannot fully be seen in the Heidelberg Disputation. That Luther says the gospel comes as the other word. And at a later time, Luther is not afraid of saying, I'm convinced, I'm assured of being saved. Whereas in the time of the Heidelberg Disputation, Luther could only develop the idea of being saved by saying, in the theology of humility, I'm accusing myself, I'm suffering the absence of Christ, and by suffering the absence of Christ, I'm convinced that Christ is present and saving. So I think in order to deal with your presentation, we should discuss the question, how does the theology of the Heidelberg Disputation relate to the later theology? And for me, the later theology is more critical over against what you said.
I have two responses. The first on the question of Heidegger. I mean, Heidegger clearly is the grandfather of all non-foundationalist epistemologies, and even the American pragmatists, as well as Wittgenstein, who have influenced me most deeply, can be in some fashion traced back to the historicism of Heidegger. But I also disagree with Heidegger's second comment about Luther. I'm struck with what I tried to do here was to lay out a dialectic that I thought characterizes both the questions of truth claiming, therefore questions of doctrine, as well as the questions of the relationship between law and gospel. The reason I went to the Galatians commentary, but also pointed out that the idea of the blessed exchange is to be found even earlier in Luther, was precisely to show that the melancholic Luther that is so often associated with the theology of the cross is only part of what the theology of the cross is. So I don't think I disagree with anything that you have said in response. I guess I'm puzzled a bit about why you think, why from your point of view you think it's a different stance than the one I was developing. Because one of the things that I'm trying to do is to make a place for truth claims, beliefs, doctrines, undergirded, though, by an understanding of epistemology, which acknowledges the fallibility of all our ways of knowing, even our knowing of God. So I was trying to talk about both sides of that dialectic. I know sometimes non-foundationalist approaches can often be immediately accused of relativism because I didn't do the philosophical side of this. That piece wasn't evident, but I tried in the philosophical side to show that truth claiming, very strong truth claiming, confidence truth claiming, is still possible even if you adopt a fallibilist epistemology. So I actually don't think we are in disagreement. Though it's interesting, and I need to understand if the presentation that I'm making leads to the kinds of critiques that you raise. I need to be clearer, I think, in what I'm trying to say. So I appreciate that.
My question is for Professor Dieter. I understand you are in communication with Cardinal Kasper. My question is, if my presentation is not shot down in the next 5 minutes, as it might be, assuming it is not, do you think the idea which is developed more fully in my paper, in which I tried to assert that Luther's idea of liturgy and music was 99% derived from the Catholic tradition. If on seeing this he might feel that his idea of Lutherans as not being church in the sense that Catholics understand church, that he might accept this position?
Well, I think he would distinguish between the question you raise now and the question of about the continuity of liturgy and the question whether the Protestant churches are churches in the full sense. I think he would be happy to hear your presentation, because I met him once when he was in a Lutheran service in northern Germany, and he was very much impressed because he said, this is quite a Catholic service, not knowing that is simply the original Lutheran service. He was a bishop in southern Germany, and I myself come from Württemberg, which is liturgically very poor because there is a Reformed influence from Switzerland. So this is one aspect that he would be extremely happy to hear this, what you said. But the other thing is that, and I think I cannot go into details, that the question what the Catholic concept of church is a different question. And the main thing is that for the full ministry, the communion of the bishops under the Pope would be a decisive element of being church, and this is what we do not have, and I think also do not want.
Okay, we may open it up to the floor. Yes, way in the back here.
Thank you, Bill Russell from Texas Lutheran University. I think I may have had an insight this morning, and I want to see if the panel will agree. In the context of a global Luther conference and in the session Continuity and Novelty, I'm thinking that what is significant for Luther, or what's global about Luther, is what is expressed and normed, at least penultimately, by the confessions. We don't propose to accept everything that Martin Luther says as authoritative as if he were an oracle of Delphi belching out prophecies. But rather, it seems as though Luther, when he got it right, he got it very, very right. And when he got it wrong, he got it wrong. And what's nice, and very, very wrong. And what is nice about the confessional witness that allows the extent or the extension of Luther's influence to go global, so to speak, is that the confessional writings of the Lutheran Church norm Luther and give expression to an overall approach to proclamation, liturgy, the gospel that I think is quite cross-cultural, global in its reach. Is that anything profound, or maybe just in my own mind? That's always a big comment, but in my mind it's a question to you all.
Anyone? Theodore?
Yeah. Well, I would say, of course, also we would also regard the confession in a certain way, in a critical way. For example, we are in a dialogue with the Mennonites, and if you read the confessions with the eyes and ears of the Mennonites, what is said about the Anabaptists in the confession, this is not quite easy. So I would also say that we have to honor our confessions, and I think mostly they are really of extremely good help. But we also have to have a critical stance and asking whether everything what is said in them is really true.
Peter Burgard? over here.
Yes, danger of inviting someone who is not a theologian and comes from a different discourses that you might get questions that you would either see as naive or that we also might find places where we can't understand one another. I think that this is one of the actually most interesting aspects of interdisciplinarity, are those places not where we can talk to one another but where we can't, and trying to figure out why. That as preface to my question. During Professor Helmer's talk, I found myself thinking again about this notion of realism that was worrying me yesterday, because thinking about music, which I think of as having nothing to do with realism, as being the non-referential language par excellence, made me wonder how it would be reconciled with the discussion of realism. And then Professor Thiemann began speaking, and halfway through he started talking about the theologian of the cross calling the thing what it actually is. And I thought, aha, now I understand. Right, here's something that I can understand as realism. And Professor Thiemann said further that this theologian describes the visible, manifest effects of the works of God. And this is where I began having questions, because it seems to me that this is something that is always metaphysical, thus not realistic, because it entails speculation that what we see in the world is the effect of something not of this world. And so this is where I have trouble reconciling, again, the notion of realism with anything religious. The evidence of things not seen seems to me to be irreconcilable with realism. It is not realism. How, and I guess this is the first of two basic questions, how can faith and realism ever be reconciled? Insofar as realism is an insistence on the representation of the world, of worldly reality, not of reading worldly things as representations of the other worldly. Realism is naturalism, if you will, not supernaturalism. Further, you went on to talk about, and I apologize for the length of the question, about religious sensibility, a religious sensibility shaped by Luther's theology of the cross, and that is open to the faith claims of others, and that reconciles truth claims, one's own truth claims with others, with the truth claims of the traditions of others. I believe that's an accurate representation. Yes. My first, I just lost my microphone.
Yeah, see, if you go on too long, they cut you off. Not allowed to develop a thought.
Hello, I'm back. Sorry. My response to that would be, how is that possible? You're talking about the compatibility of truth claims and religious pluralism. From my point of view, simply recognizing our truth as a truth claim is already an admission of contingency. Nietzsche showed how multiple truths draw into question the grounds of the possibility of the truth. Right? And contingency is thus incompatible with truth, so that the truth claim has to collapse, leaving only faith. And faith, so what you're saying is, I believe it is true, actually means I know there is no actual truth, only my belief. So I guess the final simple question, if you will, is why does faith need truth at all?
Continue in Cambridge, because I can't possibly answer you fully, given how rich that question is. Let me start with the question of realism and speculation. I mean, as you know, realism is a term that's at home in a variety of contexts, but one of the contexts is metaphysics, where realist metaphysics is contrasted with idealist metaphysics. So it doesn't strike me that realism as a just simply on a conceptual basis is an anti or non-metaphysical notion. It's a very particular kind of form of metaphysical notion, and that's the form that I would invoke against idealism as a more speculative metaphysical claim. So it seems to me that one doesn't have to accept a naturalist assumption as the sole way to interpret realism. Rather, realism is a way of interpreting evidence that seeks, wherever possible, to keep the claims, even when they are metaphysical, as closely linked to the evidence that is available for one's own reflection. Now, where one draws the line in terms of how far or how near the evidence a metaphysical claim can be, you seem to suggest that metaphysical claims, to court cannot stand again realism, and I just don't agree with that. So part of this would be to talk about. Well, I don't think it does fall apart. If you take the naturalist assumption out of the notion of realism, then you have different notions, metaphysical notions. So that's the context for one of my uses of the word realism. The second is epistemological. That is that epistemological realism, in the sense that I'm trying to use it, is related to a fallibilist understanding of how we come to know and the grounds for grounding or for warranting our assertions. And because I didn't and shouldn't have done the philosophical piece, this probably is not so clear. But what I want to say, along with a number of other pragmatist thinkers, is that there is a compatibility between truth-claiming and a fallibilist epistemology. To say that something is true depends upon the warrants that one adduces in order to support the claim to truth. And what the kind of post-Wittgensteinian pragmatist tradition has said is that those claims are always contestable, but that doesn't undermine the meaning of what it means to say X is true. So truth-claiming is possible even with a fallibilist epistemology. That claim I develop in much greater detail in the paper, and it would be interesting if you take a look at it, actually, for us to continue to talk about that, because that's probably the most controversial philosophical claim that I make. But at least it has warrant in a contemporary discussion, primarily in pragmatism. And what I want to suggest is that the sensibility that I associate with Luther's Theologia Crucis has this remarkable, in my judgment, congruence with this non-foundational pragmatist but non-relativist understanding of truth. So the reason that we need truth is because religious folk are saying that certain things are the case. That's what it means to be true. And those are not naturalistic assertions, but realist metaphysical assertions. The question is whether or not the warrants for those assertions are convincing to you or not. And therefore, for us to continue this conversation, like I just said, well, take the naturalism out of your realism, and we have some common ground for talking. And you say, take the supernaturalism out, and I'm back to my... But that's why the conversational mode is so important in adjudicating these disagreements. But it seems to me that being able to debate with one another about the warrants for our claims doesn't erode the notion of truth-claiming itself. That's kind of what I'm trying to argue.
Thank you. I saw Christine wanted to get in, did you? And then Volker in the back. And then here's the third one here, Dr. Jones.
Thank you very much for your papers. I've too been wrestling with the compatibility between asserting truth claims and being and the fallibilist stance, the hermeneutical stance of that as involving epistemological modesty and humility. The one question that I'm very interested in, and it was articulated beautifully by Peter Hodgson in his latest book, Liberal Theologies, is the notion that if we're arguing on a more positive note about truth claiming and the possibilities, the positive possibilities of dialogue to solve certain problems, I think that on one level is a wonderful and a beautiful and an important idea. But when we actually get to real conversation with real people, at least in my experience, the bottom line is dialogical failure, interpersonal failure, the problem of community at the very, very basic interpersonal levels. And I'm wondering about looking at these wonderful insights, but also taking into account the cultivation of spiritual and intellectual practices in order to address those very obstacles to dialogue, those very the emotional obstacles, I think in interreligious dialogue, on the one hand, it's nice to talk about interreligious dialogue, but on the other hand, there's some emotional blocks to power-free communication. So I'm wondering how, and I think this addresses all four of the panelists, how one can cultivate one's intellectual and spiritual resources in order to move beyond the intellectual or the discursive and to discover elements of transcendence or elements of grace, or those fissures, maybe even the musical fissures that are free from reference, in order to stand with one's convictions, but also truly allow those moments of grace and intersubjective success to transcend the general situation of failure.
Who's going first?
I'll just say something very brief, but this is what Theodore does for a living, so I'd be really interested in hearing his reaction. What I'm simply going to say is that part of what I'd like to do as I continue to think about this question is to be more concrete about what I mean with this promissory note that Theologia Crucis is a set of spiritual and intellectual exercises that can, in fact, I think, begin to shape a certain kind of sensibility that reflects just the kind of openness, but not emptiness, that is usually the problem. Certain kinds of openness empty oneself of all convictions. How uninteresting is that for dialogue? On the other hand, exclusivism and absolutism as an a priori denial of any possibility of reaching some kind of moment of grace, as you put it, also have to be excluded. So I understand that much of what I've done is a kind of promissory note, and if I'm going to go further with it, I have to specify what such practices might look like in the contemporary context, as well as kind of invoking the spirit of Luther in that regard. So I simply agree, and I think that's one of the real questions you have to explore.
Theodore, do you want to take up the challenge?
Well, I could continue and very shortly take up what I said about Luther's theology of sin. I think this is, for me, this is extremely revealing to be aware of this concept that a person, human being, looks for him or herself in all what one does. And taking this seriously would lead to an extremely self-critical attitude. What do we do with our, not only whether we make truth claims or not, but how do we operate over against others with our truth claims? And this is what quite often makes our relationship so difficult. And being aware of that we also make use of our truth claims in order to look for our own interests or domination over others and all these things could prepare a different climate for such dialogues.
Antti?
Perhaps I would also continue a little, because I think that this can be very well combined with Luther's idea of the communication, which is based actually on the golden rule, which means trying to set oneself in the position of the other and trying to see the things with his or her eyes. And this is, of course, it needs perhaps something that is called law of neighbor in order to be able to do that, so that you cannot think that I cannot think that I am ready for that, or that's something that I am self very able to do. But in this situation, it can happen.
Just real quickly, if I were to nominate a new theological virtue, it would be curiosity. I think that's one of the things that, if curiosity undermines our self-satisfaction with where we are and where we stand, that seems to me to be an inevitable virtue that needs to be present for genuine dialogue on the part of all partners in that.
That's very good.
Volker, I was recognizing you next. He's in second row from the back.
I tried to be curious for some other concepts of justification. Asking you too, Dieter, could it be a part of the problem nowadays in speaking about justification that we are used by centuries in reducing the language of justification to just one discourse, meaning the dogmatic discourse? If I look on Luther himself, when he speaks about justification, the dogmatic discourse is just one. We find it in the disputation, sometimes in the lectures, but he uses a lot of other discourses coming from the piety of his time. Just to take the famous example of the Freiheitsschrift, the soul being the bride of Jesus Christ. We are used to say, oh, this is just a clothing for what means justification. But perhaps it is not only a clothing, but it is a metaphor having its own power and having its own possibilities to make understandable what it is meant in dogmatic terms by justification. And perhaps it could be a possibility to look for those other discourses in Luther to make our language of justification freer and perhaps more ecumenic and more global.
Yeah, I would agree. I skipped one of my paragraphs due to the time constraints, where I wanted to relate the question of justification clearly to our way we deal with Holy Scriptures, because we have used to reduce justification to some formulas. For example, simply accepting oneself as being accepted, which makes sense in some contexts, or simply the distinction between person and his or her works, or distinction between what God does and what a human being do. And if we want to make plausible the doctrine of justification to our contemporaries, theologians very often try to use such formulas, but they do not integrate the richness of the biblical witness in it. And I think in order to get in contact with this richness, it is important to have different discourses, as you say, and experience what it is about. And so I think indeed we have heard about the musical discourse, so to speak. There are different ways in which we can deal with what justification is about, and we should indeed not limit it to the dogmatic discourse, and not even, especially not to some formulas.
Dr. Jones, and then Dr. Hodgson behind him, and we can get Professor Grosshans. I think that may be all the time we have.
Professor Peter Bergard has already made the same apologia that I need to make about coming from the outside and asking a question that's embarrassingly naive. So this is probably because I'm not a Lutheran theologian and I don't understand something very basic. But my question concerns the meaning of faith, which is presumably one of the most basic things at all in Luther. And one of the phrases that I came across over and over again when I was reading Luther is that Christ dwells in us by faith. And that seemed to mean that it's a promissory thing. And then Professor Dieter starts talking about how Christ really dwells in us, and God really dwells in us, and it's something that's almost analogous to the Eastern Orthodox notion of theosis, which I do know something about. And it seems to me, if that's the case, doesn't that require, if that's what it means for Christ to dwell in us by faith, doesn't that much more robust understanding of Christ dwelling in us also mean a much more robust, I might also say, psychological, experiential understanding of faith? Won't it also change how Lutherans understand faith if we take that more robust notion of the results of faith?
Yeah. Well, I fully agree, but I would say that the concept of trusting is in itself a pretty robust concept, because trusting a promise is always happens always in a conflict with just opposing experiences. And this is what yesterday it was mentioned, that Luther always talks, when Luther talks about experience, this is not so that we experience our faith, but that we experience how strong the promise is. And this is what happens in trusting the promise of God. And my comment was simply to ask, what does it mean that Christ is present? I have the impression that when we use this phrase, it is, as Augustine talks about time, he says, well, when we use the word time, we have the impression that we understand it. But when we ask, well, what is time, then we have difficulties. And here I think there is an evidence that it means something to say Christ is really dwelling in us. But what does it mean? What does this presence mean? And so I made the appeal that we have to develop this. And one attempt is to develop this concept of trusting over against or in the midst of quite opposite experiences. But then I think, as Professor Lepine said, there are different contexts in which we will broaden the understanding of what this presence means. And Luther explains this with different models, as the marriage and faith is the bride. What is this? The ring of marriage between Christ and the soul, and all these different concepts try to bring to speak about experiences of different kind that people make in dealing with this presence or this dwelling of Christ in them.
Okay. Professor Hodgson?
Given the lateness of the hour, I'll be very brief. I liked the direction of Ron Thiemann's remarks very much, but I do have one question or puzzle. I'm wondering what happens to the sola Christus. Are you suggesting, in effect, that the Theologia Crucis undermines or subverts the sola Christus, so that Christians can no longer claim that Christ is Christ alone, or Christ is the only way of salvation? Perhaps the way for Christians, although even within Christianity we can appreciate the great diversity of forms that Christ assumes as the way. So even within Christianity, there's no one way. And then I'm sorry we've run out of time, because I was intrigued by Professor Helmer's remarks about musical harmonies. And I'm sort of wondering whether that might be an opening for a theology of religions or for interreligious dialogue, to look at the way in which musical harmonies are expressed across the diversity of religious traditions in ways that are both complementary but also perhaps quite different.
Wow. Paul, do you want to start with that?
Music is a servant art in the religious sense. It's there to act as a functional thing. And when it becomes itself the idol, it destroys itself and the people, I think, that practice it. If that's common across the religious faiths, that's certainly something we could agree in, that God is out there, something is out there which through music we use with the best of our ability to praise. And if that's a common element, this is of course very new territory for me. Certainly that would be a binding element. There are of course many systems of harmony and many musics, as it's called, systems that are diverse and specific to times and places. There's a division there, but I think music as the binding element, if it's used as a servant art, as a means, could be a communication among many. Yes.
Real briefly, a wonderful question, Peter. If the solus Christus remains a fundamental assertion of Christianity, it does so within the context of Christian practice itself. And what it means is that for me to take on this form of identity and to pursue this form of discipleship means I keep my eyes fixed on the one who beckons to me to follow, who is Christ. Now, within the Christian tradition, there will be diversities of the construal of who Christ is, but I still think that it can have a kind of function within the Christian framework, which I believe has been the only function that it was ever intended to have. Because once you go into the interreligious context, as you know extremely well, the very way in which we talk about the ends of human lives is so itself diverse, so that salvation, which is a peculiarly Christian notion, has very little resonance in religions like Buddhism, where enlightenment simply cannot be compared to salvation. So part of what has to happen is a way of thinking in much more strikingly diverse ways about what other religious traditions mean by the ends for which human beings are intended. And it goes to the social goods question as well. The musical analogy is an extraordinary, interesting suggestion, but it seems to me that, just as we have 12-note scales, and as we have music that breaks the harmony and uses cacophony as an expression, we somehow have to integrate that aspect of music so that the harmonic, it's just like the political debates about whether or not a population needs to have a set of common convictions in order to be a society that can act morally. How you think about difference. We need both harmony and dissonance, just like we need both commitment and dissent. So if we can take that musical analogy and run it through cacophony as well as through harmony, I think it's really an interesting, provocative way of thinking of this.
Hans Peter, you have a quick question.
Oh, I actually have a lot of questions, but I will reduce them to two, I would say.
We only allow one.
Only one? Oh, that's a pity. So I want to concentrate on the question on Ronald Thiemann, his contribution, which I found very interesting and which reminded me very much to paper or in a small book of Schubert Ogden on that subject, because he put forward a similar position like yours. I especially, with my sympathy for Barthian theology, was also thinking there could be some more outline to the Lichterlehre, the doctrine of lights in the later parts of Barth. But my question is now, what is the criterion to identify the truth in other religions? And it might be that we identify from a Christian perspective something as true in another religion which is not put forward there as a truth claim. So in your presentation, I had the feeling that it's almost in the discussion in that we are asked to accept the truth claims of the others. But with your model, we are more or less having our own criteria to decide about the truth of others. So there might be a very interesting interaction come out from that. Yeah. So sorry, the others.
Well, thank you. Let's thank our panelists this morning.